Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we have some important election news for the 2026 Senate elections. Now October's been very busy obviously with the 2025 elections happening on November 4th, but I wanted to interject with this video because it's very important news for the 2026 midterm elections, which in just a few weeks will become the main focus for politics and for elections going into 2026. And that is the Democratic governor of the state of Maine. Janet Mills has officially announced her long-speculated candidacy for the U.S. Senate in 2026, taking on Republican incumbent Susan Collins. Now, this is news that really is not too surprising, but has been speculated for months now, including national Democrats like Chuck Schumer and other top Democratic allies in Washington wanting to get Janet Mills to run against Susan Collins as they view her as the most viable Democratic candidate that could defeat the longtime Republican incumbent in this Maine Senate race. Now, this is obviously very interesting news and very important news for the Democrats. However, there are a very large segment of Democrats in the state of Maine that actually will not be too happy with this news. I'll get into that in just one moment. But certainly, Janet Mills is a very big name that is now entering this race, and this is going to become a very important marquee matchup, even though it already was, to watch for 2026. Now, on the Maine Senate seat itself, and what I'm talking about here when I say that some Democrats may not like this. So this Senate seat for 2026, we know, is one of the most closely watched ones in the United States. Now, Susan Collins is the only Republican representing a state that voted for Kamala Harris in the 2024 presidential election. And after we saw Democrats like Sherrod Brown, Joe Manchin ultimately ended up not running, and Jon Tester lose in 2024, politicians that are Republicans and Democrats representing states that don't vote Republican or Democrat at the presidential or Senate level are starting to really get phased out, essentially. There are some Democrats and Republicans in swing states that voted one way or the other, but basically the states that aren't swing states are not really electing party or candidates of the opposite party so much anymore after 2024. And Susan Collins is one of the last remaining ones that filled that category. Now, obviously, the Democrats are hoping to be able to defeat Susan Collins and flip a Republican Senate seat to the Democratic side in a state of Maine that voted for Kamala Harris in 2024 at the presidential level statewide by, we can go to 2024 here, that voted roughly about 7 points for Harris over Trump in 2024, and in 2020 voted for Joe Biden by about 9 points at the presidential level. So that's how the state voted in 2024. Now, the Senate side of things, the Republican Susan Collins, one interesting note here, has not technically officially filed for re-election yet. She has publicly expressed interest in running for re-election, but she is not officially a declared candidate. For now, we're going to assume she will run until she says she won't, but that is just one interesting wrinkle on the Republican side. Now, the real interesting thing on the Democratic side. Just because Janet Mills, the governor of Maine, is in the race does not mean every single Democrat is necessarily thrilled in bowing down to her and anointing her the Democratic nominee. Because Democrat Graham Plattner, who has the endorsement of a lot of prominent progressive Democrats, is staying in the race and is taking the fight to Janet Mills, and Janet Mills and her team are taking the fight to Graham Plattner. So this Democratic primary is by no means over and going to be a very interesting one to watch for. Now, obviously, this race has just been a few days old now, so there isn't any polling data between what Mills and Plattner could look like, but there is some potential that this may not go 100% the way some national Democrats may think, where Graham Plattner could potentially have like a Zohran Mamdani type effect in the Democratic primary, get enough support, especially among younger voters in the state of Maine, and potentially pull off an upset in the Democratic primary in the same way Zohran Mamdani did against Andrew Cuomo. Now, some of the differences in this race, though, versus that one is Janet Mills, the governor of Maine, does not have approval numbers in her final term as governor of Maine and the same problems that Andrew Cuomo did, so that's going to be different, certainly. But Janet Mills and Graham Plattner have the potential to be a very competitive Democratic primary where things may not ultimately end up going 100% how we expect them to be. Another key wrinkle here is that Mills, if she were to win, would become the oldest freshman senator in history at 79 years old to start the term. And that could be an argument that Plattner and other Democrats in the race make against Janet Mills. Now, being the governor of the state of Maine and having a proven electoral track record, I do think Janet Mills starts out as a favorite to win this Democratic primary, but Graham Plattner is certainly going to be someone very important to keep an eye out for. Now, just for the overall endorsements thus far, the only official endorsements for Janet Mills at this current point in time are the U.S. Senator from Nevada, Catherine Cortez Masto, and Dan Cleveland, a brewery owner and candidate that was running for this race that dropped out and has endorsed Janet Mills. Though top Democrats are rumored to be supporting her, like Chuck Schumer, Kirsten Gillibrand, who are in charge of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, basically the wing of the party trying to get more Democrats elected to the Senate, they both of which endorsed, or not endorsed, but basically endorsed Janet Mills in this race. Now, Graham Plattner has some very well-known names as well. Rob Wright, the former U.S. Secretary of Labor under Bill Clinton, but U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders, Representative Ro Khanna, two very popular progressive names in Democratic circles. The former vice chair of the DNC, David Hogg, has endorsed them, and some other celebrities, Ken Casey, John Hodgman, Josh Ritter, as well as some labor organizations and organizations as well. So Democratic primary between Mills and Plattner could potentially get pretty interesting in the months to come, heading into 2026 as well. Very fascinating to see how that plays out. Susan Collins herself even mentioned that's just interesting to see how the Democratic primary plays out as well. Probably assuming Janet Mills will be the candidate, but we'll have to wait and see how that all goes. Now, for the rankings, no surprise here. Since this announcement has been made, both Cook Political Report and Established Crystal Ball have updated their rankings to toss-up, anticipating that Janet Mills will become the Democratic nominee and face off in the general election with Susan Collins. They both have the race now at a toss-up. Race to the White House and Inside Elections both had their ratings done before the news of Janet Mills entering. They had a toss-up and tilt Republican for Race to the White House and Inside Elections. The only polling data that have been done thus far is from the Democratic pollster Zenith Research, which is a sponsored poll of a progressive nonprofit news media organization. So the rule I usually do, if you've been following my videos that I make, is that for a partisan or internal poll, I shifted 5 points in the opposite direction of the pollster to account for the bias of the pollster that is being done. So a 5-point Democratic lead for Janet Mills over Susan Collins essentially means a tied race between Mills and Collins, whereas a tied race between Collins and Plattner, I think really means about a 5-point lead for Collins over Plattner using that scale. But that's just not really too important. I just like to make that note before I begin my analysis on this race. But look, Janet Mills versus Susan Collins is going to be a very interesting race if that does ultimately end up happening. And I'll go with, I really think it's going to be Mills versus Collins first. I don't think Plattner is going to beat Mills in the primary, but I'll go down the runway of Plattner versus Collins after. But I think Mills versus Collins has the potential to be a very, very close race, and one the Democrats have been looking for in Maine for a while now, which is defeating Susan Collins in Maine. Because Maine has some very close elections, especially at the Senate level. When Susan Collins ran for re-election in 2020, she got 50.98% to the Democrat Sarah Gideon's 42.39%. Now, the state of Maine is really important in their election system, which is they utilize the ranked choice voting system in the state of Maine. Now, what that means is if no candidate on the first round, basically the regular voting round, does not get on election day more than 50% of the vote, it goes to the ranked choice voting system. Now, on this one, Susan Collins actually did. She got 50.98%. Sarah Gideon, the Democrat, got 42.39%, but independent Lisa Savage and independent Max Lynn got roughly combined 6% of the vote or so as these third-party candidates. And given Gideon only got around 42.4%, if it were to go to ranked choice voting, pretty safe to assume a lot of the 6% would probably have gone to Gideon, and that would have made the race seem a lot closer than it ultimately ended up being. Now, that's obviously hypotheticals. That did not happen. We don't know for sure, but pretty safe to assume that would be the case. Now, this time around, it's going to be Susan Collins facing off against potentially the governor of the state of Maine, Janet Mills, who in her own right has an electoral history in Maine and a rather strong one. In 2022, she won re-election for governor of the state of Maine against a familiar name in the state, Republican Paul LePage, who was the former governor of Maine from 2011 to 2019 when he was term limited in Maine. So this race, ultimately LePage ran again because he was not serving a consecutive term. He was running for a new term here, but not consecutively. And Janet Mills won in what ultimately ended up being not that close of a race. Janet Mills getting 55.69% of the vote, LePage getting 42.45% of the vote. We can go to the results here. Now, the polling and such showed a 7-point lead for Mills over LePage as well in this race from 538 a likely Democratic lead, and she did end up technically winning by a likely Democratic margin, but Janet Mills certainly won a lot of the undecided vote and ended up winning by a pretty substantial margin when everything was said and done. Now that was 2022. In 2018, when she was first elected, this was after Paula Page was term limited and was leaving office. Here, Janet Mills won by 7 points or so, 50.89%. Republican Sean Moody, 43.18%, and Terry Hayes got 5.91% as the independent. So Maine is shown to have, at very least, a decently competitive governor election. On the Senate side of things, is also a very interesting story because the Senate side, there's two really types of races here. There's the Susan Collins ones, and then there's the Angus King one. Angus King, who is an independent senator that caucuses with the Democrats, he won by 17.4% in 2024, running against both a Republican and a Democrat. And then 2020, I just showed you, Susan Collins won by 8.6% against the Democrat Sarah Gideon, breaking 50% and stopping ranked choice voting from going into effect. Angus King in 2018 won by 19.1% against a Republican and a independent. And then the last time it was up was 2014 when Susan Collins won by 37 points in that Senate race against now Secretary of State Shana Bellows. So what does this all mean for 2026? Well, you're basically having Susan Collins and Janet Mills, two politicians, two women in the state of Maine, that both have shown in their own right very impressive wins in pretty decently tough political climates. Susan Collins winning re-election in 2020 on the same ballot when Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump at the presidential level in the state of Maine by 9 points. And Janet Mills winning re-election in 2022, though Maine is more of a likely Democratic state, she did win it by 13.2% against a former governor. In the 2022 midterm, which going into it was looking more of a Republican-favored midterm, didn't really end up being that way, but on paper it probably should have been, considering that it was a midterm in the Democratic President Joe Biden's first term, or term as president and such. So Mills and Collins both have their own track records of being very strong general election candidates, and now they're facing off in 2026. When we talked about the Senate race in North Carolina, the comparison I was using was the 2018 Senate race between Republican governor at the time Rick Scott and Democratic Senator Bill Nelson, and one that was really going down to the wire, and Rick Scott ended up winning by 0.12%, a situation where an incumbent who many Democrats thought could not lose, the Republican governor ultimately defeated him. Now, I was talking about North Carolina in that regard as a potential comparison. That could also very well be a potential comparison for Maine as well in 2026. A Republican incumbent who certainly has her approval issues, but is a strong political performer, one that Republicans could probably feel like could probably win re-election again and probably should, but the Democrats could potentially catch Republicans maybe slipping at the wheel here and flip a Senate seat from red to blue. Now, as for the Senate map, we'll put the Senate map here for 2026. Now the Senate map looks like this, where Republicans have favored in 51 Senate seats, Democrats favored in 45, and now there are 4 toss-up seats in Georgia, North Carolina, Michigan, and Maine. Before this election news came out, I would have had Maine starting out around the lean to tilt Republican column. Now I have it definitely in the toss-up category. Once you go through the map and assign the rankings for the states, right now I think it looks kind of something like this. I think the Democrats are in a better position than the Republicans right now. In Georgia, where they're off to about a lean Democratic lead, Michigan's really going to be a very close race to watch. I think it comes down to the wire again, but without President Trump to help drive turnout, I think the Democrats narrowly squeak out a victory there, right around a 1-point win. North Carolina is going to be really interesting because I think Michael Whatley can win this race. I think Roy Cooper also is a very strong candidate for the Democrats. Right now, I also have it at under 1 point for the Democrats at this current point in time, but would not be shocked to see Michael Whatley win. But in the last prediction, I had Susan Collins narrowly winning the state of Maine. That was when it was Susan Collins versus Graham Plattner. Now, for Janet Mills versus Susan Collins, I would actually have it starting out in the tilt Democratic category. We don't know what 2026 is going to be like yet, but given the historical expectations of midterm elections, usually they go pretty strongly for the party not in charge of the White House and not in charge of the Senate and Congress. And this one would be the Democrats that seek the most to gain. And I think the state of Maine, seeing as it voted for Kamala Harris in 2024 by a pretty decent margin, not as much as 2020, but still around 7 points or so, it clearly has more of a Democratic identity than a Republican one. and having their current governor being the Democratic opponent to the Republican Senator Susan Collins gives the Democrats a stronger chance to win this race. So I'm starting it right now in the Tilt Democratic column, meaning I have it going blue by under 1 point. And I'm saying under 1 point because I think it's going to go to ranked choice voting. And I would not be shocked one bit to see on election night Susan Collins maybe starting out with a lead on ranked choice voting right around 48.5% to 49%. Janet Mills not too far behind there, around 47.5%, 48%, and then going to ranked choice voting where Janet Mills narrowly wins by under 1 point is kind of how I see it going down right now. Kind of similar to how Maine's 2nd District, where Jared Golden ultimately ended up going down in 2024 against the Republican Austin Thurl, where it was a super close race on election night, required ranked choice voting to break the 50% number, and then Golden narrowly won. I kind of think that's how Maine goes right now. If Graham Plattner ends up defeating Janet Mills in the primary and it becomes Plattner versus Collins, I still think it's a very competitive race. I still think it may need ranked choice voting. I do think in that scenario, though, Susan Collins does win, as like the analysis that Salvador's Crystal Ball gave on their website of this race, I think Plattner being more progressive would actually hurt him in the general election a little bit among undecideds and independents that would be more willing to break with the Democrats and vote for Susan Collins, like many of them did in 2020. And they'd be more willing to do that again and vote for her than vote for a Democrat that's more in the Bernie Sanders wing of the party. So for Janet Mills versus Susan Collins, I think tilt Democrat. For Collins versus Plattner, I think it'd be more tilt Republican. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you did. Leave a comment below. Tell me your thoughts. Keep an eye out. I have some very important videos planned for this week for the 2025 elections that you're not going to want to miss out on. Thank you so much for watching. Hope to see you in a future video.